The first thing they noticed was the light. It wasn't sunrise, it was fire. Pine knots wedged in bamboo torches, jammed into cracks in the rock, so the smoke climbed in twisting ropes and the sparks fell on bare backs. Hammers struck steel in a rhythm that carried through the cut, a narrow wound in the hillside, no wider than a rail bed and steep as a throat. Shadows leaned long against the walls and moved with the men, who swung picks in pairs, traded the handle to keep the pace, and learned to time their breaths with the blow. A sergeant counted in broken English, Japanese, Thai, and anything else that moved the line. The jungle pressed in with heat even at night. Sweat soaked the rags that had once been uniforms. Each blow rang the stone, and each ring sounded like a clock. 6 months earlier, they had been soldiers. Singapore fell in February 1942 and disgorged them by the tens of thousands, British, Australian, Dutch, a handful of Americans, and a larger number of civilian workers caught in the wrong place. They were herded into barbed wire compounds and told they would be moved to work details. The rumor that it would be in the north felt like a lie, until the day the gates opened and they were marched to trains, already stinking of coal smoke and old cattle. Boxcars marked for 40 men took 60 or more. Doors were slid shut and pegged. They learned the smell of 100 throats in a sealed wooden box, and the particular silence that falls when people run out of water and argument at the same time. The line they were to build had existed in staff rides and old plans for decades, a corridor over the Donna Range that would bind Bangkok to Rangoon without the sea. The sea had grown dangerous. Submarines hunted Japanese shipping between Malaya and Burma. A railway through Thailand and across the border would feed an army advancing toward India. The order went down, and the men went north to Ban Pong, then marched on foot in files toward camps with names that sounded like coughs: Konyu, Hintok, Kinsayok, Tanbuzayat. They shouldered what they could and learned to measure distance by collapsed bridges and the rate at which boots fell apart. Work began with the dry season. The first tasks were simple in description and hard in fact: clear jungle, set camp, cut sleepers, and carve a shelf into hillsides that did not want company. Tools were few and often broken: picks with heads that shook loose, hammers with handles cut from green wood, shovels with a split that bit the hands. For every 100 Allied prisoners, there were 300 Asian laborers, conscripted from Malaya, Burma, and Java by recruiters who paid advances and then delivered the men to the same wire and the same heat. They came with fewer rations and no advocates. The guards called them Romusha and counted them like cordwood. When food ran short, it ran short for them first. Disease did not so much arrive as bloom. Mosquitoes rose out of puddles the way sparks rose from the torches. Malaria came in cycles of chills and fever that left men shaking on bamboo platforms and then sent them back to the line when the spike passed. Dysentery moved like a rumor, every tent, every latrine, the smell living in the dust. Cholera arrived with the rains and killed before help could find a pulse. The men learned the look of it and learned to keep the dying apart, and still the numbers climbed. Medical officers who had packed their kit for field surgery reinvented themselves as carpenters, botanists, and beggars. They boiled water in oil drums and shaved bamboo into splints. They traded respect, buttons, anything, for quinine and sulfa and a little rice. They cut rotting ulcers back to clean tissue with blades sharpened on smooth stones and told jokes in quiet voices when the work made men cry. The first months were bad. The months that followed were worse. In 1943, as Allied pressure grew elsewhere, the Japanese command pushed the schedule forward. In the camps they called it the Speedo. Hours stretched from dark to dark. Rest days disappeared. Guards measured progress in yards and beat it out of bodies with bamboo poles when the numbers did not please. Men learned the whistle of a switch through air and the heavy, dull sound it made on ribs. Men learned how to fall in ways that protected their hands so they could still work. They learned to carry a mate between them by threading a pick handle through his sleeves and keeping a straight face when a guard looked up. Some stretches were simple. Others were names that would not let go. Hellfire Pass was a notch that ran through a ridge of quartzite like a saw mark. It took months of night work under torchlight to open, the smoke hiding the stars and the sound carrying down the valley. Farther south, the Wampo Viaduct walked along a cliff above the quay, a ladder of teak piles driven into shivering slots with hand-rigged pile drivers. At Tamakam, the river ran shallow over stones the color of tea, and the men learned to read rain 2 hills away, because a flash flood could pick a file of workers off the bank like ants from a stick. And at Tamarkan, where the river widened, the Japanese threw up a bridge of timber and then a stronger span of steel they called Bridge 277. The prisoners learned to align plates by eye and striker blows, to heat rivets in charcoal and fling them red into a waiting bucket, to catch them in folded rags and hammer them home before the heat died. The railway advanced from both ends, laid with rails whose numbers never quite matched, and sleepers cut from trees that bled sap on skin until it burned. When the monsoon came, the line sank under mud, and the camps under a sweet rot that made food taste like mold even before it spoiled. Yet still the work crawled forward. Wooden crosses appeared along the path, then simpler markers as the wood was needed elsewhere. The Asian laborers were buried in shallow graves off the embankment, with no names to mark them. Men remembered the faces and could not remember the words they had used to say goodbye. The line was completed in October 1943, 415 kilometers of rail, leaping gullies on trestles and curling around hills with curves so tight the engines squealed like animals. The first trains carried rice and ammunition north and casualties south, and the men who had built the line were ordered to repair it faster than bombs and rivers could tear it apart. Allied aircraft found the bridges in 1944 and returned to them until the river boiled with splinters and smoke. The prisoners learned the geometry of shrapnel. They learned to run trenches out of camp kitchens so the cook fires wouldn't give them away, and they learned what a near miss does to hearing and to courage that depends on sleep. There were acts of resistance, most of them small and quiet. A surveyor nudged his transit half a degree and sent a future pier into softer ground than the plans intended. A clerk miscopied delivery totals, so the fuel allotment always arrived light. A fitter taught a guard that an axle ran smoother if it was a fraction thinner, then shaved it to a tolerance that guaranteed early failure a day's march up the line. An Australian doctor named Dunlop argued, threatened, and soothed by turns, until guards let the worst cases be counted as hospital and saved from the line for a day. No one called it heroism. They called it getting through. When the war turned and Burma became a march in the other direction, some camps were emptied toward the coast. Others were left in place to maintain the track. Men who had once known every serial number on their rifle could now name every bend between Kanchanaburi and Three Pagodas Pass by the feel under their bare feet. They learned the sound of an armistice only when the guards were suddenly careful and then suddenly gone. In August 1945, Allied teams came up the line with tins of milk and paper that said it was over. The men who could walk helped the men who could not to the trucks. The men who could not walk yet stayed to whisper to those who would never rise and promised them someone would come back. The numbers were counted in the months that followed. Of roughly 60,000 Allied prisoners sent to the railway, more than 12,000 died. Of the Asian laborers recruited or seized from villages all across Southeast Asia, estimates ran to at least 90,000 dead, and perhaps far more. Cemeteries were planted at Kanchanaburi and Chungkai and Tanbuzayat. white stones in rows so straight they look like orders finally being followed. War crimes trials named officers whose signatures had turned hunger into policy and beatings into routine, and handed down sentences that could not make a single man breathe again. The railway returned to jungle in long stretches. Parts of it still carry tourists who lean out to photograph the river and call it by a movie's name, not knowing that the tune they hum belongs to a different bridge and a script that got too much wrong. The cut at Konyu remains, rock walls scored by pick and fire, a wind now working where breath once fought for purchase. If you stand there at dusk, you can still hear steel on stone if you let yourself, and you can still see the way torchlight throws the human body against a wall and makes it look larger than it is. The men who survived took fragments home, a scar like a map across a shin, a cough that never stopped, a habit of putting food in a pocket to taste again later. They told pieces of it and kept pieces back. Some saved the worst for other men who had been there. Some returned to the line years later and rode it from station to station, stepping off where a camp had stood and measuring the distance to a river they had carried in their head for decades. They read the names on the graves and heard the ones that had none. The forgotten soldiers of the Burma Railway worked because they had no choice, and lived because the man beside them passed a bucket or a bowl or a joke across a plank at the right time. The track they laid was a weapon that cut their hands, and it was also the path the world used to find them when the war ended. Jungle has taken most of it back, but the grade remains if you know where to look. It begins in a boxcar where there is no air, and moves through a night where the only daylight is fire, and it ends in rows of white markers under a clean sky that was not clean then. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.